That's Steve. Let's give Steve a very warm welcome, and I'm going to pass the mic over to him.
Thank you, Allison. Good morning. Hi, my name is Steve Fairchild. I just had a flashback to back in, 10, 15 years ago on these name tags. I don't normally wear name tags, but I would write Batman because everyone knew me. So yes, I'm just a regular member here. I used to speak a lot up front like this about like 10, 15 years ago. I was a leader on a prayer team. But then I had kids, and now I need to use my prayers to get here on time. So, but this is my first actual sermon. So why am I doing this? What inspired me? I just hit the big 50 birthday, and I just feel like giving like some life experience and wisdom that I have to share. And I hope at the end of this you might feel that I've done that. So, do we have no title slide? No slides? All right. Okay. Well, today I'm going to be talking about the Leviticus food laws. You're going to hear about them all a lot. They're more conventionally known as the Jewish food laws. Things like no pork, no shellfish, no camel meat. That's all in your Bible. And my talk links back to Shepherd's from last week, because if you remember, he talked about reading the Bible through different lenses. And one lens is moral, and another is ecological, and which is the relationship between man and nature. And I'll discuss those in conjunction with the food laws. So the last time I spoke was Earth Day in 2025. I did something similar with Noah's Ark, talking about it ecologically and morally. So, by way of background, I've studied biology a lot, and for my master's thesis, I did some work on the Endangered Species Act. A little complicated statistic stuff. I won't bore you with that. But one of my graduate advisors was Dr. Lee Talbot, and he was one of the co-authors of the Endangered Species Act. So it was a pretty cool program. So why am I discussing the food laws of Leviticus? That might sound like a very obscure topic. Well, because I followed them. I did them growing up. So why would I do that? Everyone asked me if I was Jewish. No. Okay, there we go. I grew up in what was called the Worldwide Church of God. It was started in 1933 by Herbert W. Armstrong, but he initially called it the Radio Church of God. And it had a distinct connection with Seventh-day Adventist stuff. No one really is clear why. We think maybe Armstrong went to an Adventist church and liked it and just copied it. So we followed a lot of the rules that are found in the Hebrew scriptures, and that's why a lot of things are considered Jewish. So a lot of people thought I was Jewish because of that. Like we did a seventh-day Sabbath, which began at Friday night and ended on Saturday night. And so, like, when I first saw a calendar that had Sunday as the seventh day, it just kind of blew my mind. So I never went out with friends on Friday night, or went to high school events like football games if they were on Friday night. And we couldn't watch TV or go to the movies. So on Friday nights, when my friends were doing things like sneaking into pools and throwing lounge chairs and tables and umbrellas into the water, I was at home playing board games with my family. So, but eventually my friends got invited to parties with girls, but I still couldn't go through on Fridays. So, we also did the Jewish holidays like Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah, but we called them the Day of Atonement and Feast of Tabernacles, or Feast of Trumpets, sorry. And it also meant no Christmas, no Easter, and definitely not Halloween because of the perceived connection with pagan religions. And for Easter, we just did Passover. So it's basically the same time anyway. But definitely the food laws. No pork, no shrimp or lobster. The Bible calls these things as unclean, and I was very familiar with them. So what happened to the Worldwide Church of God? Mr. Armstrong died in 1986, and he was succeeded by Joe DeKoch, who slowly started unraveling the rules. Women could wear makeup. He also allowed birthday parties. So my first birthday party was when I was 13 in 1989 because Mr. DeKoch had just changed the rules. And so in December 1994, everything exploded. Mr. Koch did a 3-hour sermon where he explained that the church was transitioning to just a regular evangelical Protestant. And for a community of like 130, 150,000 people, this was just a huge earthquake, a huge spiritual earthquake. I was 18 at the time. I was going to the church's college in Texas, and the following semester, it was like a civil war, but like non-violent, but just very tense. And in 1997, the church changed its name to Grace Community International. And so if you Google it on Wikipedia, you'll find that name now. And one of my friends did a podcast about the Worldwide Church of God and the changes. And do we have that slide? So this is the title logo of the podcast. That's Herbert Armstrong looking down at you. She called the podcast The Unchosen Church, and that's a snarky play on the fact that we thought we were the chosen church. So if you have any further interest in this, I would refer that to you. There are a couple there are no documentaries about Worldwide, but there are some YouTube videos, but they were made by the competing church leaders. And there's nothing really on YouTube about like the impact on regular people. But the podcast does kind of go into that. So I'm getting Big Brother vibes from that, so let's get back to the title. All right, take it down. All right. Okay, so now personal stories. So growing up within the church made you a bit of an outsider, for many reasons, obviously. And if you were hanging out with your family on Friday nights playing board games, that's kind of like, it doesn't help. And it's one thing if you're small, but as you get older, you have to decide, do you follow the rules yourself or abandon them? Sorry. So a few anecdotes. When I was like in 3rd or 4th grade, I ate a hot dog at school, and it wasn't beef. And I told my parents about it, and I thought they were going to spank me, but they didn't. I was really surprised. But imagine in that church there were parents who did spank their kids for not following the food rules. And then so fast forward to high school, and I was suggested to me to get a picture so you can have a visual. So that's me in high school. I was a 15-year-old sophomore, and that guy did not eat pork. I was on the freshman and JV football teams, and those games were on Thursday night, but the varsity games were on Friday night. So in my junior year of high school, I took a cooking class called Gourmet Foods, and it was very popular because you got to eat and there was no homework. And one day we made a homemade pizza from scratch. And this included making the dough from flour, and I think the cheese and tomato sauce were store-bought. And the other kids wanted pepperoni on their pizza, and that's a pork product. So I objected and said, no. But I also objected it to being on any portion of my pizza because in the oven, the pizza oils would melt and get on my side of the pizza. So they accommodated me, and they just made 2 pizzas, so 1 cheese and 1 pepperoni. And I always felt bad about this, even at the time. But certainly after the church imploded. And you get tired of having to defend your religion all the time over what others might think is like a minor trivial issue. And being different is tiring. So another anecdote, the summer after my junior year, I went to a lacrosse camp, and on the final night, they were grilling meat, and I asked the chef what meat they were using, and he actually got mad. He said, I cook good food, or something like that. And I had to explain to him what it was, where I was coming from. I wasn't like thinking he was a bad cook, and he was fine after that, but I never liked having those discussions. And sometimes within the church community, you'd have like a hierarchy of people following the rules. So around the same time as that, I went to a church camp, and my mom sent me a care package that had Skittles in it. And you probably don't know this at the time, but in Skittles at the time used gelatin that they got from boiling animal bones. They stopped in like the 2000s from doing this, but this is 1991, and I have no idea how you figure that out. And so an older kid, he sees me eating Skittles, and he's like, "That's unclean." And then he explains to me about the gelatin comes from pig bones, and I was like, I never understood why he told me this. It's like, kind of ruined my happiness. And at the same camp, I think this is a funny anecdote. It's kind of a little tangential, but the one day, like for breakfast, all the boys got 2 sausage links, but all the girls got 1 sausage link. I just think it's funny, and the girls complained. That's how I remember it. But as weird as the Worldwide Church of God was, we at least believed in dinosaurs and in a 5 billion-year-old Earth. So when I look back on these rules and their impact on my life, I think what stands out to me is that they weren't just about food. They reminded us every day that we were different, and that shaped our sense of identity and our belonging in the world. And in many ways, I was an outsider doing the food laws, but at some point, I did decide that I didn't want to do them anymore. So part of the 1994 changes meant that we could eat pork now, and some people, even if they left the church, still follow the old rules because you can't just change what you eat. And that's actually with my mom. My mom won't eat pork to this day, or shellfish. But I certainly left behind the food laws, and then after I had the biology training, it kind of changed things. And then in 2010, 2011, I picked up a commentary on Leviticus that kind of made me re-examine everything about these food laws, and we'll touch about that in a bit later. So, what are the food laws? They mostly are in, Leviticus 11 has like the first list, just a long list, clean and unclean, and a similar version appears in Deuteronomy 14. But there's food laws like all over the place, but those are the main parts where people go to. And what is Leviticus? Leviticus is the 3rd book of the Bible, and Deuteronomy is the 5th. That repeats and summarizes a lot of Leviticus in 3rd person. And there are some interesting differences between Leviticus and Deuteronomy, but just for another day. And when was Leviticus written? The narrative literalist approach is that it was written by Moses when he left Mount Sinai after he smashed the 10 Commandments. So that would be around 1300 BC. And for Deuteronomy, that was about 40 years later, at the end of wandering in the desert. But modern Bible scholars would probably put it in during the Babylonian captivity, around 600-700 BCE. So as far as the narrative goes, the food laws were given us basically as soon as they left Egypt. So clean and unclean. What is the purpose of these laws? The short answer is we just don't know. The words clean and unclean suggest that it's about human health, but these are just English words in translation. And if you read the laws, they describe animals as clean versus unclean. But lots of things made you unclean, not just food. So touching a dead body made you unclean, having a skin disease, menstruation, childbirth, those also made you unclean. Being spat on, I found. So is this all about human health? Probably not. And so I found an interesting part about the remedy. Yeah, here we go. So in here in Leviticus 13:15, to become clean again, the priest had to sacrifice 2 animals. So that implies and suggests that there's a spiritual component to being unclean as well. So we really don't know. There's no easy way to kind of extrapolate what they mean to what they would have meant at the time. So when I say that in that way, these laws might sound exclusive. Sometimes talking about these laws makes people uncomfortable, and I want to respect that, and I'm not endorsing all the ways that these laws have been used in the past, and I certainly don't do them verbatim now. And I also want to recognize there are Jewish people today who do these laws in some form. And as I become an adult and look more closely at these laws and the spirit behind them, what they're trying to do, I've come to appreciate certain aspects of them. And maybe there's something about God and in creation and our relationship that we can take away from looking at these laws in more detail. So, okay, so we're going to discuss what the actual laws are. So here's a couple examples. This is the rules for land animals. Among the animals, whoever you divides the hoof, having cloven hooves and chewing the cud, that you may eat. That's the big one. That's what it excludes pigs. So what is chewing the cud? Chewing the cud is the digestion in the four-chambered stomach. So the plant matter kind of goes back and forth from in the chambers. It gets microbes. It kind of breaks down, and it happens when it happens with the breaking down the cell walls of plants. And so when animals do this, the cows, antelope, deer, sheep, goats, even giraffes. So by definition, anything that chews the cud must be a herbivore, because they exclusively eat plants. That's what the stomach does. So chewing the cud is for herbivores. And is there some kind of significance to that? Again, it's unclear. And there are lots of vegetarian animals that are unclean, like rabbits and camels and some turtles and lizards. They're herbivores, but they're unclean. So let's move to aquatic animals. So the aquatic animals, the rules are anything with fins and scales are clean. So what's that? Well, tuna, salmon, herring, trout. What's excluded? Shellfish, eels, sharks, and whales, of course. And I just want to highlight this real quick. It's a very well in that passage about the fins and scales. It also says, you shall not eat their flesh, and you shall regard their carcasses as an abomination. So in these food laws, if you touch the carcass of something unclean, you are unclean, and it's important. That's an important thing I'll bring up later. So there are some other random rules, and there's a list of birds that are clean and unclean, and but that's not like a herbivore thing, because chickens and turkeys are clean, but they also eat bugs, and turkeys will eat snakes, so it's not necessarily herbivore carnivore. But the ones that are excluded are higher level carnivores, like eagles, falcons, those birds of prey, and definitely vultures, scavenger animals. But again, the purpose of the rules isn't stated, but after studying biology, I've come to appreciate a certain aspect of these laws. It's very beautiful. So here's a couple of pictures. Does anyone recognize the thing on the left? That's right, Galapagos Islands. I went there in 1997 as part of my biology, and even got course credit for that. And then on the right is me at a black rhino orphanage in Zimbabwe. So rhinos are unclean. And it's through this education that I began to realize that there was a profound level of ecological wisdom in these laws. So what are the benefits of the food laws? Well, again, clean, unclean suggests human health. And one possible benefit is, when my wife was pregnant, we went to the doctor, and they gave us a list of do or not eat, of clean and unclean meat, really, of a list of food that she could eat and things that she could not. So tuna was no, definitely. And the reason was because a higher, tuna had lots of mercury, and so that you have these, and definitely like sharks and other large predatory fish, doctors advise pregnant women not to eat. And many of these animals are unclean. Now, but tuna, which is clean, would be kind of unclean to these pregnancy guidelines. So, but it's just something interesting to think about. So another reason is for species protection. We often think of clean and unclean as the unclean animals are the unlucky ones, as if God is punishing them for that. But if we can look at it the other way, it's actually protecting the animal. So in ecology, animals at the top of the food chain are almost always the least numerous. There are fewer lions than gazelles, fewer hawks than sparrows, and apex predators reproduce more slowly and depend on large populations of animals that they can eat. So if humans ate the apex predators, those animals, there's fewer of them, and they would be more likely to go extinct. Now notice something very interesting in Leviticus. The Israelites weren't simply told not to eat them, they're also told not to touch their carcasses. In other words, these animals had very little economic value. You couldn't just eat them, you couldn't profit from them, you couldn't make practical use of their remains, like skins. So whether or not that was the original purpose of these laws, the effect would have been to reduce the incentive to kill these animals in the first place. And I mentioned that I picked up a commentary on Leviticus, which got me thinking, and it made this very precise point, that it's about, you could look at these rules as species protection. And that's all the commentary said, but with my biology training, I recognized the implications immediately, and it actually has some interesting parallels to the Endangered Species Act. So modern conservation laws work in a very similar way. The Endangered Species Act doesn't just prohibit killing endangered animals, but also prohibits possessing, selling, transporting, or profiting from them. So conservationists understand that when you remove the economic incentive to exploit a species, you're much more likely to protect it. And, well, this is interesting. So, as I said, rhinos are unclean, same with elephants, and leopards and whales, and all these would be protected, as endangered species. So, no ivory trade, it's very famous, and rhino horns, of course. And 1800s, we, as a species, hunted whales for oil, but if those are unclean, we could not use the whale oil, at least according to these rules. So I find it fascinating that Leviticus may have accomplished something similar thousands of years earlier. And I'm not suggesting that the Israelites had a modern understanding of ecology, but I do wonder whether these laws reflect a wisdom that we're only beginning to appreciate. Perhaps they weren't simply about ritual purity. Perhaps they also taught God's people that not every creature exists for human use. So the other thing is, ecosystem protection, which I call this kind of a top-down ecosystem protection by protecting the carnivores. So another thing that ecologists have discovered is that predators play a much larger role in in ecosystems than we often realize. Whether we think about the wolves or lions or hawks, it's easy to think of them as dangerous animals, but predators actually help keep ecosystems healthy. Here's why. So I made this with emojis, of course. So the bottom level is the plants, okay? This is a very simple version of what, when ecologists talk about these things, the food webs get very complicated. The middle level are the herbivores. You have a deer, you have a goat, sheep, and the top, wolves. So this is the natural balance of things. So you have lots of plants, you got some herbivores, and the wolves on the top. If you notice, there's one wolf because one wolf might need like 100 deer to exist. So if you have a family of wolves, you would need like 1,000 deer or whatever. I'm just making up these numbers, but that's just how it works. And like 1,000 deer need lots of plants. So without predators, those populations of herbivores can grow rapidly. So this is, the X represents no predators. And what happens? The mid-level herbivores expand. They multiply. There's nothing to eat them. So they just do whatever they want, have as many babies. And just as a quick aside, the way that mammalian or a lot of species, the number of offspring they have kind of factors in the fact that there being predators eating them. So if you remove the predators, they're still biologically going to have just as many children, offspring, as they would if there's predators. So this is what happens. The herbivores explode, exponentially. And then what happens to the plants? The plants all get eaten. So if you remove the predators, eventually the plants go away. And if you have more plants, then you have less soil erosion. You also have habitat for creatures. Yeah, but this is more the normal situation. So yeah, a forest is a habitat for lots of animals. This is it's not just it's not just affected by the goats and the sheep, but with more plants, you have the beavers, you have things living in the plants, you have birds nesting in those plants, in those trees. And every ecosystem is like this. When the herbivores get out of control, the vegetation gets scarce. But predators keep the herbivore population in check and allow vegetation to rejuvenate and allows other animals to use those vegetation as homes. And when you're aware of this relationship, you can see it pop up in a lot of places. I'm going to take a quick tangent here to the story of Cain and Abel. It actually underscores some of this tension right here. Cain, the farmer, killed Abel, his brother, and the shepherd. And shepherds have large flocks of animals, which both eat crops and attract predators. So farmers don't want predators around, and they don't want their crops being eaten by the large flocks of animals. So to prevent that, the farmers send the shepherds away. And one of the best known examples, parallels in modern times, is the Yellowstone National Park. After wolves were eliminated, the water quality went down, the biodiversity went down because the elk and the deer were eating all the plants. So in 1995, they reintroduced wolves to Yellowstone Park. And as a consequence, the water quality actually got better, and beavers, who knew it, but beavers started coming back to Yellowstone Park. And of course, the wolves got out of Yellowstone Park and started eating the cattle of local ranchers, which I think is very similar to the Cain and Abel story, which is why I brought that up. So there's a lot of tension here between farmers and shepherds and ranchers and the rest of the country that wants to benefit from a healthy ecosystem in Yellowstone Park. So from studying biology, I find it fascinating that many of the animals the Israelites were told not to eat would occupy these same ecological roles. And I can't say that the reason behind the food laws was ecology, but I do wonder whether God was thinking that when God gave these rules to the Israelites. Perhaps those laws weren't simply about restricting what people could eat. Perhaps they were also about helping manage the land in our ecosystems. So I call that top-down ecological protection. So I want to draw your attention to what I call bottom-up ecological protection. So, okay. So earlier I mentioned about the aquatic animals have, the rules were about fins and scales, and that meant no shellfish. And at first glance, that might seem, okay, what's the point about that? But the lower food chain animals, especially oysters, clams, and mussels, play a very powerful role in water quality. So you might not know this, but New York Harbor was once home to one of the largest oyster populations in the whole world. And a single oyster can filter dozens of gallons of water each day. It removes excess algae, it improves water quality. And oyster reefs also provide habitat for fish and other marine life and protect against storm surges. In other words, oysters help make the whole ecosystem possible. And there are other creatures that are unclean that also play a big role in this, kind of like what I call the bottom-up eco protection. Those are like earthworms and even honeybees. Now, I can't say that, again, ecology was the purpose of these food laws, but it kind of makes me wonder. So I don't, my point today isn't to convince Christians to, that we should all stop or start eating following the food laws, but the early church wrestled with that very question in the book of Acts. The apostles literally debated whether or not what laws new Christians, converts should follow. And they concluded that following these food laws was not a requirement for being Christian. But I wonder if maybe we left too much behind. And that's been part of the surprising part of my journey. And for years I couldn't see these food laws apart from the church I grew up in. And they reminded me of feeling different and wondering where I belong. So maybe there was something there more worth keeping. And when I studied biology, I discovered that we had, there's a lot of ecological benefit to these rules. And I also began to see a vision of creation that I hadn't noticed before. And some of us grew up in churches or families that cause real pain, and sometimes leaving those places is exactly the right thing to do. And healing doesn't always mean throwing everything away. Sometimes with enough time and enough grace, you can return with fresh eyes. That's my boy, I know it is. Thank you, James. Anyway, so I think the food laws invite us to ask, what is the creature's place in God's world? And those are very different ways of seeing creatures. When we see creatures as part of God's creation, we're invited to push back on certain modern assumptions. Just because we take something doesn't mean we should. Not every forest exists to be cleared. Not every species exists to be harvested. And not every corner of creation exists for human consumption. Creation is a gift. It is a resource. Maybe that's why, thousands of years later, I find myself very grateful for these laws. And in fact, I would say, I was thinking about this last night, that what these laws are, this is one of the best environmental laws ever written in the history of mankind. It's what they do and how they protect the environment is just very profound. Okay, so let's do practical suggestions. So reflect on your own food laws. That we all have them. We all have a sense of what's clean and unclean. We might not call it that. Health, unhealthy. There's those people might be vegan, gluten-free, all that stuff. We all have our own rules, and maybe those rules cause conflict in your life and need to be reexamined, or maybe not. Maybe you need more rules. Number two, simply to me, like I'm actually quite happy to talk about my Worldwide Church of God past. But, when I was much younger, I ran away from that. It was something I didn't really talk about with anybody outside of the community who understood, because it made me feel weird. And maybe you have something in your past that you're ashamed of, but might actually be a benefit if you re-examine them. Maybe just look at your own story with fresh eyes and maybe find healing. Okay, for the third practical suggestion, this is something real fun. I would suggest watch The Biggest Little Farm. Has anyone seen it? No? I hear some murmuring, but it's got like 93% fresh rating on Rotten Tomatoes. It's about a man or family who leaves the big city life and they buy a biodiversity farm. And it discusses a lot of like ecology and like how anytime there's a problem on the farm, it's solved by another species on the farm. And it's a lot of fun. It's a good story. So that's it. I guess we can transition to worship, and I'll invite the prayer team or the worship team up and just close us out in prayer. Heavenly Father, we just thank you for this opportunity to be here. We thank you for creation and the animals and the plants and how everything just works together to keep us alive and healthy. And we just give this all to you. In Jesus' name, amen.